Good morning. I'm so happy to introduce a few people who are here to welcome us to the Southeastern Partners in Plant Conservation meeting. First, I would like to introduce Mary Pat Matheson. She's the Anna and Hayes Mershon President and CEO of the Atlanta Botanical Garden.
Thank you, Jenny. Oh, it's just so wonderful to see you all here in our beautiful botanical garden. This meeting, I have to say, I'll give credit to John Clark. He came to visit, I know he's like, what? He came to visit us, probably a year and a half ago. And I hope most of you know John Clark is the Executive Director of the Center for Plant Conservation and now is also the lead Director of Conservation at the San Diego Zoo. He came to visit us and we were talking about the work that we do. And it became clear to all of us, I think, that we're all so busy just doing the work that we do day to day that we really don't know what is going on around us in our region and around the country. So we had a really informative time together where John was able to see the work that Jenny and Ron Dieterman and Carrie and members of our team are doing, and we had the opportunity to learn more about what the Center for Plant Conservation is doing. We're a part of the CPC, but also to know what his plans were for the future. And one of the things that we talked about was looking at conservation from a regional perspective. And out of that, Jenny and I got together and thought, well, we have the Center for Southeastern Conservation. We're doing work in multiple states in the Southeast. You all are doing the work all over this region. And it just was high time to get us all together and start talking. And that's really what this meeting is today. I just have the honor of welcoming you and making sure that you enjoy our beautiful garden, not just all of the sessions, but you wander around and see every square inch of it, because this is really a spectacular garden. And kudos to the team that was here in the early days. This is our 40th anniversary, but from the very beginning, Ron Dieterman, Mildred Folkley, and others made sure that the Atlanta Botanical Garden was committed to both plant collecting as well as conservation. So we like to tell everyone in our community we're more than just a pretty face. We're really here about plants, and the work that you're doing is the same. And so we hope the outcome over the next 3 days is to get connected, and as Vivian and I were just talking, developing an action plan where we can move forward in the region collaboratively. Collaboration really is the new key term today in the nonprofit world. We can be better by working together. So I look forward to seeing what comes out of this wonderful 3-day session. And again, want to encourage you to get out and examine every square inch of our beautiful garden and our collections while you're here. I know you had a nice reception last night, and if you're interested in the glass, you can watch them dismantle it, because Chihuly has to leave and our holiday light show is going to be turned on in 10 days. So we got a little bit going on outside, and you have a lot going on in here. So enjoy your 3 days in Atlanta at our garden, and I can't wait to hear what the outcome is of this wonderful meeting. Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce Leo Miranda. He's the Assistant Regional Director of the Southeastern U.S., Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a crowd. I love it. And so, good morning, everybody. And Leo Miranda, I'm the Assistant Regional Director for Ecological Services, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's for the Southeast region, including U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. If you can listen to my deep, deep South accent, that's why I'm originally from Puerto Rico there, so it doesn't get more southern than that. So again, thank you. And within our program, we manage everything dealing with Endangered Species Act. That's why I don't have any hair left. But but one thing that we are really proud of, and I'm personally really proud of, is at-risk species conservation. And most of those at-risk species are actually plant species that nobody, well, not nobody, not a lot of people have been paying attention, but you all and a few others. And now, because we have been getting a lot of petitions to list species under the Endangered Species Act, we're paying a lot more attention and conserving plants. When you conserve these plants, you conserve the ecosystem. And if you conserve the ecosystem, that fulfills the #1 goal of the Endangered Species Act, which is not conserving just the species, it's conserving the ecosystems where those species live. And that's actually the first page on the Endangered Species Act that not a lot of people talk about, is conserving ecosystem. Just to put it in perspective, we have about 376 species listed under the Endangered Species Act in the Southeast region. We just got petition to list an additional 361. So that's basically doubling if we go there and list all of those species. And we don't want to do that. We want to actually do as much proactive conservation as possible so we can preclude the need to list those species, and we can actually focus our limited resources to those species that actually deserve listing. And finally, I would like to thank the Atlanta Botanical Garden. What a wonderful facility here. Wow. And just outside the backyard of our office. I'd like to say thank you to them for hosting this meeting. And also would like to say thank you to Carrie Radcliffe, Jenny Cruse-Sanders, Joanne Baggs, and the planning team for all the work before this meeting. And also I would like to thank U.S. Forest Service for helping us support these kind of activities, as well as the At-Risk Species Workshop, together with the National Wildlife Refuge Association. But most importantly, I want to thank all of you for your passion and dedication to plant conservation across the nation and even internationally. So thank you, everybody, and I'll be around for a little while. I need to head to South Carolina now, but welcome, and thank you for being here.
Next, I would like to introduce Cara Chadwick, the Acting Deputy Regional Forester with the USDA Forest Service.
Thank you, Jenny. Good morning, and welcome to all of you. It's really wonderful to see all these partners out here joining us for the next few days. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to say a few words on behalf of the USDA Forest Service Southern Region. I'm really honored to be a part of this conference that brings so many partners together under one roof to talk about plant conservation efforts. You know, as you all know, the southern region, our southern forests, contain an abundance of diverse and a rich habitat. And especially the southern Appalachian Mountains, they contain irreplaceable habitats that, you know, present us with conservation opportunities that would be found in very few other places. So the diversity is everywhere in this region, from the mountains to the coast, from the rolling longleaf pine savannas to the swamps and bogs. Nationally, the Forest Service is committed to increasing our pace and scale of restoration efforts, restoration and conservation around these diverse plant habitats and around conserving plant species. So we can't do it alone. The southern region's forests are owned only about 11% federally owned. The bulk of forested lands is owned by individuals, families, and corporations. And most of these parcels are less than 100 acres in size. So to conserve plant species, we must work with partners. The Forest Service has been working with partners for, for many decades now, and we have a number of success stories. And I'm just going to talk about, real quick, two of them. In Louisiana, we had a project to restore one of the rarest and most spectacular orchids that's found in the South. And this initiative was begun by a Shreveport high school student. The project goal was to grow 200 Kentucky lady slippers from seedlings and then plant them back out onto the national forest in Kentucky where he had collected the seedlings. Today, this project is still ongoing, and the student, Kevin Allen, is still intimately involved in this project. Another example is around the 1988, the white-haired goldenrod. In 1988, the white-haired goldenrod, which occurred predominantly on the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky, was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. This species stood at slightly more than 90 colonies, and many of these colonies were on the decline. However, last year in 2015, the U.S. Forest Service announced the proposed delisting of the white-haired goldenrod from the federally threatened and endangered list. So how did we do this? How did we get this proposed delisting? The U.S. Forest Service and partnering agencies, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission, and the Red River Georgia Climbers Coalition began efforts to protect and restore the goldenrod using a simple grassroots approach. They used easy-to-install fencing as barriers to divert the foot travel and avoid the trampling of the plant, and they used chicken wire. They also used interpretive signing to let folks know what was going on around the chicken wire. It was a quick approach, it was easy, and most importantly, it was effective. Not only did forest visitors respect this fencing, but they also carried the message of what we were trying to do as partners, the plant conservation efforts around white-haired goldenrod. Without the continuing impacts from the trampling, the plant is now thriving. So what is behind the success of these two stories? It's working with partners, coming up with unique and creative ideas. So we, the Forest Service, are especially pleased to be working with all of you, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Wildlife Refuge Association, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance, also the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and working with you in plant conservation efforts. But everyone is welcome, and we're really excited to see potential partners from a wide range of agencies and organizations, and you're all committed to the goal we share of plant conservation. My hope is that, and expectation, is that this conference will continue to build on existing partnerships and begin to forge new partnerships over the next several days. And what better place to have this, what better place to hold these conversations than the Atlanta Botanical Garden? So that's what these next few days are about, working together to address conservation across landscapes, across boundaries, and across jurisdictions with partners. So working together, we really can make a difference. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. I know folks are busy, but we need to build these regional partnership networks to make it work and promote strategies for conservation. And especially big thanks to the Atlanta Botanical Garden for holding this conference, and to all the folks who worked together to put this conference together. Thank you.
I would also like to introduce Dr. John Ambrose, who's the Chief of Non-Game Conservation Section with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources.
Thanks, Jenny. This is a really impressive group and a very important meeting, and it makes me think I should have given a little more thought to my comments. I did scribble a few things down in the last couple minutes, but just to help me remember some key points. First of all, thanks to the planning team that put this together, Jenny and Carrie and all the others. This is a really important next step in conservation planning for rare plants. I've been with Georgia DNR about 30 years, and I can remember the old days when our expertise in the agency consisted of Tom Patrick, who's still with us today, thank goodness. I also remember the early days of collaboration with Henning, with Ron Dieterman, with Mal Hodges of the Nature Conservancy, with Cindy Wentworth from the U.S. Forest Service. And this effort, this collaborative effort has just grown over time into a real network that we call the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance. I was honored to receive a national award on behalf of the Alliance at the annual meeting of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. It's a tremendous honor shared by about 42 different organizations. And the whole idea of the Alliance is to share resources and to share expertise. And this group gets things done by not being afraid to roll up their sleeves, to get dirty, to get muddy, to get sooty, and to do things for rare plants and for plant communities in the state that really couldn't be achieved by one organization alone. So we're really proud of the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance. I see this meeting as really the logical next step to take this conservation planning and implementation up to the regional level. As you all know, in the Southeast, we have tremendous resources, biological diversity. We also have a lot of challenges. We have urbanization, we have changing land use, we have problems with invasive species, we have problems related to climate change, tremendous problems to deal with, and that just really underscores to me the need to continue these collaborative efforts. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here today, to take time out of your busy schedules. And you'll make this meeting a success by your involvement. So give yourselves a big hand.
And finally, I would like to introduce Dr. John Clark, who's the president of the Center for Plant Conservation.
Good morning, everyone. How y'all doing? I actually get my y'alls honestly. My father is from Louisville, Kentucky. I had a discussion earlier whether or not Louisville counts as the South, but technically it does. Cincinnati, I'm actually from Ohio, and Cincinnati is considered the northernmost southern city. Would everyone agree with that? No? Okay. Well, we can discuss that over cocktails later, I'm sure. But I have incredibly fond memories of the South as a child. I mean, this was the place where we went to have fun. We would come down here on family vacations to go to the Great Smoky Mountains. I remember a trip vividly where we came down to Stone Mountain, Georgia. We would go over to Myrtle Beach, Virginia Beach. It's a tremendous part of the world. I mean, the diversity here is unparalleled in many respects. Dr. Alan Weakley, who's here and he'll be speaking shortly, will talk hopefully at great length about the diversity here and why it is so unique as well as important to global conservation concerns. In terms of conservation and what you're doing, I really appreciate your kudos earlier, Mary Pat, for considering this conference. The seed was planted, I guess, in that conversation. I love getting credit for things that I don't feel like I did. That's the best kind of credit sometimes. But the reality is collaboration is key. This seems to be the year of collaboration. Everyone is talking about how we can work better together, how parts of the world that seem somewhat isolated can connect to other parts of the world to understand how people do things, why they do it differently, why they do it the same, and how we can learn from each other. In these collaborations, we find ways to achieve things that seem intractable at times. When you look at global conservation challenges, there are over 80,000 species of plants considered threatened with extinction if we don't do something different. Simply ramping up our efforts and doing the same thing is not enough. We have to figure out novel ways of approaching conservation. We have to use new tools, new technologies. We have to understand the biology of these organisms in ways that we currently don't, so that we can ultimately understand what it takes to keep them around long term. The only way we're going to be able to do that is to tie everyone together in a way that allows us to achieve great things. Regional conferences like this are exactly how that's going to be done. Everyone in this room has expertise to bring to the table, and not only through your talks and listening to other people's talks, but in the conversations that you have over the next few days, are really what this is all about. And Jenny, of course, should get a lot of credit for this and thinking about the long-term ramifications of what we can do. Tie it together here. Let me help you tie it together on a national level, and let's take this thing on a global scale so we do the best conservation in the United States that can continue to be a model for the rest of the world. Thank you for allowing me to introduce things. I'm excited about the next couple days and look forward to talking to each and every one of you. And let me know how I can help you do the great conservation work that we all want to do. Thank you.
Now it's my turn. I'm Jenny Cruse-Sanders. I'm the Vice President for Science and Conservation here at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. Since we're all one big conservation family, I want to invite everyone in the back to come get closer with your conservationists. Fellow conservationists, please take a chance to sit down while we get started with the program. This is unprecedented. I'm so excited you're here. I want to start with a sense of place. We're here in the Botanical Garden. We had a wonderful reception last night to say goodbye to Chihuly and say hello to each other. And I want to thank Mary Pat for inviting us to have that reception. Chihuly is one of the reasons we don't have garden maps to give to you. We had too many visitors over the past few weeks. We ran out of them. So we will navigate with the wonderful help of the volunteers who are here to help us. They're wearing T-shirts that says the Southeastern Partners in Plant Conservation. If you're leading a session after the break, please come see me and I will help you find where you're leading the session, or if you're in a session, we will make that happen. We are going to have tours of our conservation collections this week on Wednesday at 3:30 and Thursday at 11 a.m. And the sign-up sheets will be at the registration desk. So please come join us for a behind-the-scenes tour of our collections. Now I get to talk about the resources at this meeting. We have agencies, land managers, conservation partners, botanical gardens, utility companies. We have an incredible resource in this room with just the people, the knowledge, and the expertise. We have the Center for Plant Conservation, the Plant Collections Network with the American Public Garden Association. We have NatureServe here. We have the Center for Biological Diversity is represented here. We have the National Seed Strategy to give to you. We have funding opportunities through groups like the Association of Zoological Horticulture. We have workforce development teams who are going to be here and talking with us, especially during our networking session. We have publicity. We have student ambassadors who are here. Please complete the survey that Carrie has been sending around to you, because that's how we're going to share information about you and your expertise with the group that's here. So I want to thank the planning team. We will hear from more of the core planning team during the next few days. Mike Harris, Duke Rankin, Chuck Hunter, Joanne Baggs, Mincy Moffett, Jennifer Seska, Dennis David, Mike Chenard, Gretchen Dillinger, our facilitator, and Carrie Radcliffe. Her attention to detail and enthusiasm and excitement about this meeting has had to come together. I think I've outsourced my left brain to Carrie. She's taking care of all the details. Our technical and capacity building sessions teams have spent many hours on the phone planning this meeting, planning the capacity building, the sessions where we'll go over the plants. These experts are going to moderate the meeting. They're going to guide our discussions. They're our guides through the next few days, and I want to thank them for their time and commitment. So my job right now is to provide a roadmap for the next 3 days. And I'm going to use two phrases that I've heard at other meetings. I had the great opportunity to go to the Natural Areas Association meeting 2 weeks ago in California, and I loved their theme, which was turning words into action. So I'm going to say that out loud. We're going to turn words into action here over the next few days. There's another theme that I really love. It's the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Southern Company Stewardship Partners meeting. I love it so much I want to steal it. It's Conservation Southern style, and that's what we're doing. We're Conservation Southern style. So, We're creating an information framework and setting the tone with this meeting by having plenary lectures in the morning from Alan Weakley, Vivian Negron-Ortiz, and Joan Walker. We're going to be talking about plant diversity, resources for conservation, and an important ecosystem in the Southeast, the longleaf pine ecosystem. But I want to talk about you, the audience that's here too. We oftentimes, as gardens, go to garden meetings, as academics go to academic meetings, as agency people, you go to agency meetings. We have an unprecedented opportunity to be here together in a meeting. And wouldn't it be amazing if at the end of this meeting, every agency biologist or administrator knows all of the partners and their capacities so that at a time when the funding comes through for the priority project, they know exactly who to call. And the partners know who their agency contacts are, so when it's late on a Friday afternoon and they're about to leave their audience, they look down at their phone and say, oh, I better take this. This is important. And then a rare plant is matched with the resources, the partners, and the capacity that it needs, that it all might make a difference, that we can work together to do something like that. So we're going to so let me talk to you about the next 3 days. Leading up to this meeting, there have been a session of smaller workshops, 6 workshops, at-risk workshops, where there was information gathering about plants and animals. A lot of information was gathered, and the purpose is to make informed decisions about whether certain species need to be listed under the Endangered Species Act or whether other conservation actions are useful for them. You're not supposed to be able to read that. This is an example of the kinds of lists that have been collected leading up to this meeting. And we're using that, gathering more information during this meeting so that we can set priorities. So this is the type of information that went into the list that we were developing for this meeting and through the at-risk workshops. And these were led by Chuck Hunter and Dennis David leading up to this meeting. We've organized things into geographic regions, collecting information like conservation status, geography, habitat attributes, ecological systems, et cetera. And we're in the technical sessions, we will be talking about these things further. But we also want to identify categories of need. And this is how we're going to be collecting this information in the next few days. Looking for whether certain species need land management, whether they're found on public lands, whether they need land acquisition, whether there are safeguarding needs or research gaps. These are some of the topics that we'll be talking about in the next few days. So that we take that information that's been gathered for informed decision making, and we as a group can set up conservation priorities for the species on the list. We will be talking about resources for conservation, and so we can be thinking about, as we're identifying conservation priorities, what resources are available to put towards these priorities. We have capacity building sessions to share know-how, to share what we know. The whole purpose is to tie it together into a network so that we can make intended and effective conservation action. So here we have technical sessions. They're divided into geographic regions. Many of you signed up for the appropriate one. And then species workshops and categories of need that we'll be discussing tomorrow. We have capacity building session today, resources for conservation discussions tomorrow, and we're going to focus all of the last day on building conservation networks, but the purpose is to be building the network as we go. So we can look at the benefits of working across a regional scale. We can become more efficient and coordinate our priorities. Gardens, for example, make great partners for region-wide conservation initiatives if we can clearly identify where our objectives for conservation are at our institution and how those meet the priorities of our partners. Well-identified partners, we're all here. We can highlight our shared priorities and our capacity, target the point where our strengths meet the need, and the funding will follow the priorities. The region is divided up into different ways depending on how you look at it. This is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Region 4. We have the U.S. Forest Service, divides it in a different way. And then the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives divided in a different way. So again, having a meeting like this helps us to identify the priorities across these different regions and identify where we can come together. Oh no, Mincy's stool fell down. I did not mean for that to happen. So we're using the model of the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance. And Mincy Moffett has given us this model of a three-legged stool, which is supposed to be standing up, where one leg is the regulatory agencies that provide oversight and permission to do the work that we want to do. One leg is the land managers who restore the habitats that are so critical for rare plants. And then the conservation horticulture where we can grow and restore rare species back into the landscape. And so again, as partners, we can take an adaptive approach to our projects. We can be good partners. We can follow up on our paperwork and reports and return calls. So we as partners, as conservation partners, have so much to bring to the table for this. I want to say that we are realistic when we approach this meeting. The at-risk list that we're going to be looking through doesn't include every rare plant that needs attention. But it's a good start. And the network and the process of setting priorities is an excellent start. We know that we may walk out of here with intended conservation action as networks, as local networks and a larger network. We may only walk out knowing exactly what we want to do for a small percentage of that list. But that's impactful. That's getting it going. That will make a difference. This is an example of conservation partnership, Georgia Aster, with the Candidate Conservation Agreement that was signed in 2015, I believe, and research that was done and contributed to some of this ideas with 3 botanical gardens in North Carolina and in Georgia, the State Botanical Garden of Georgia, the North Carolina Botanic Garden, and here at the Atlanta Botanical Garden working with Danny Gustafson at the Citadel. This is another example of a plant in need, a candidate, the white fringeless orchid Platanthera integralabia that was listed this year, and the kind of partnership that can move its recovery forward even as it's being listed. Some of the work that we've done here at the Atlanta Botanical Garden to restore habitats, restore plants back into the natural areas where it grows, but also we've working with partners in Tennessee and seeing those partners come together from UT Chattanooga, from the Department of Natural Areas, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and working to restore this plant. Florida is an excellent example of partners working together, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Botanical Gardens, the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance, and the Florida Park Service. And I remember meeting Tova. It was my first year here working at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. Tova Spector, who was with the Florida Park Service, when we first went down to look at Torreya taxifolia and saying, all right, Tova, Torreya is important to you. What else is important? What are some of your other priorities? And she said, well, Conradina is a priority and pitcher plants. I said, oh, pitcher plants. We can do pitcher plants. Pitcher plants we can do. I want to recognize that some of these partnerships have led to great research with Torreya taxifolia. Jerry Pullman's here in the room, and he and his students have developed novel techniques for storing embryos that were propagated in tissue culture, giving us another tool for working with Torreya. So through that first conversation about pitcher plants with Tova, we've organized a whole nother great project where we're working in hundreds of acres to restore wetlands, both in Florida and in Louisiana, with funding through the Coastal Program that jump-started the project, and then with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund. So these partnerships can be very impactful. They can they can move us forward step by step. So I was looking for something auspicious or to inspire me for today. I looked to see, is November 1st an important day in history? I know Alan will have something really informative and insightful. I didn't come up with anything, so I thought, well, let's turn it on its head, like Mincy's stool. I'm sorry, Mincy. And think about, wouldn't it be amazing if 15 to 20 years, this day in history was marked as the day for that the Southeastern Partners in Plant Conservation got together, and they created a plan that conserved a significant proportion of the rare plants in the southeastern United States. We could look back and think, what a great thing we did. So thank you. Now it's my pleasure to back away from the microphone and introduce Alan Weakley. Alan Weakley is a plant taxonomist, a community ecologist, a conservationist, specializing in the southeastern United States. He holds a BA from UNC Chapel Hill and a Ph.D. from Duke University. He has worked as a botanist and ecologist with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program and as a regional and chief ecologist for the Nature Conservancy and NatureServe. He is currently director of the UNC Herbarium and a department of the North Carolina Botanic Garden, and teaches as adjunct faculty at UNC Chapel Hill and at the Highlands Biological Station. Alan is author of The Flora of the Southeastern and Mid-Atlantic States and co-author with Chris Ludwig and Johnny Townsend of The Flora of Virginia, which has received 5 awards, including the Thomas Jefferson Award for Conservation. He has also released an app, FloraQuest, and co-developed with Michael Lee and Rudy Nash, covering the southeastern United States flora. He has authored over 100 journal articles and book chapters and is in high demand as a speaker on plant taxonomy, community classification and mapping, biogeography and biodiversity. He is active with the Flora of North America Project and the United States National Vegetation Classification. Serves as an advisor to the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program and North Carolina Plant Conservation Program, and is co-founder of the Carolina Vegetation Survey. As a trustee and board member of public and private conservation granting agencies and foundations, he has helped oversee, wow, 400 million of land conservation grants to the southeastern United States. Alan, thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Jenny. Wow, what a great room of people, so amazing. Lots of dear friends and colleagues from my current life and various previous lives with the Heritage Program and working with USDA Forest Service across the region and Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's an honor for me to be here and to be able to talk with you all. So I'm going to talk today about the native flora of the southeastern United States and try to give you all a perspective, I guess, a kind of deep time perspective on where that flora has come from and where, with luck and work, we can help it go. And so everyone in this room, I think, knows that the southeastern United States is this sort of boring, uniform oak hickory forest with very little biodiversity. No, there's more to it. So when we look at maps of species diversity, we see scenes like this with the southeastern US important. If we bump it up to a different taxonomic level to genus diversity, the map looks like this. If we bump it up to family diversity, wow, what happened to the southeast? Well, the diversity at these higher taxonomic levels reflects the fact that the southeastern United States is a landscape of deep relictual retention and development of biodiversity. That's kind of going to be my theme through this talk. If we look at areas of narrow endemics, this is one map that can be put together. Depending on your methodology, you can put together maps that look a little different. If you look at number of woody plant species, definitely a southern bias, and the southeast very well. The paleo-dicot clade, the magnolias and lauraceae and things like that, when we look at a map of the diversity of those ancient relictual groups in the world flora, this is what it looks like for North America. You know, I say forget California. Native grass diversity. Well, of course, the native grasses, they're going to be most diverse out in the Great Plains, right? Not so much. So once again, the southeast and especially the southeastern coastal plain actually has greater diversity of grasses than any other part of the country. So how has the southeast developed and retained this biodiversity? I like to think of it as sort of this multifactorial equation of geology times soils times fire times temperature times rainfall, and most critically times time. Time is the ingredient that I'm going to talk about quite a lot here. So earth, air, fire, water, and time. So I'm going to touch very briefly on each of those sort of themes. So if we look at the landscape diversity of North America, the physiographic provinces, we see in eastern North America, centered around the Appalachians, a tremendous juxtaposition of different physiographic provinces that have accreted to the North American continent over hundreds of millions of years. If we look at geologic maps of any state in the Southeast, and I picked one of the most diverse ones, Alabama, we see a little bit of cheering there from the Alabama cheering section. So we see tremendous geologic diversity, and that geologic diversity translates to soils diversity and also maps onto ancient landscapes. And the coastal plain, you know, everyone knows the coastal plain is flat, boring, and vermin infested. Homogeneous, et cetera, except that once again, it's not. There's a lot of underappreciated geologic and soils diversity in the coastal plain also, which generates a lot of its diversity. Elevation in eastern North America, we do middling, up to 6684. We have this gigantic coastal plain low area near the ocean. Precipitation, we have a goodly amount of variation in precipitation from temperate rainforests with 110 inches of rain per year around Highlands, North Carolina, to drier areas to the west in particular. And then the violent south. We have a lot of disturbance in the south. I guess you could take that at several levels, but we have a lot of disturbances. We've got storms, rain, wind, and so forth. We have scour areas along our rivers that create interesting habitats created by high rainfall events. And we've got fire. Boy, have we got fire. We've got fire all across the region, especially in the coastal plain. This is a map of flash density, number of lightning strikes hitting the ground per square kilometer per year. And down here in Florida and the Gulf Coast and up the Atlantic coast, we're up in the 8 to 16 or more lightning strikes per square kilometer per year. So we also have disturbance, burning where it can, fires burning where they can, and creating a variety of habitats. So this is a map put together by Cecil Frost, who I believe is here, though I haven't actually seen him. There he is. Hey, Cecil. Of fire regimes, pre-settlement fire regimes across the Southeast, trying to reconstruct our understanding of that. And then in really deep time, the southeastern U.S., the eastern North America, the inland provinces have been available for land plants since there were land plants, constantly. There's never been a time where there were not land plants in the southeastern United States since there were land plants. So we are an ancient landscape, which is not something that many other places in the world can say. So here, does this look familiar to anybody? Any guesses as to family? Magnoliaceae, yeah, this is 115 million years old, a liriodendron relative, clearly placeable in the Magnoliaceae, and being browsed by some of the local fauna. So, and then more recently, of course, we've had significant and major changes in vegetation, impacts to vegetation caused by past climate change. And as we look forward to a landscape, a world in which climate change is going to continue, and maybe, presumably, we would judge at increasing rates, I think we can learn from considering the effects of past climate change on our flora and considering using that as a bit of a model to understand what future climate changes may bring about. So not very long ago, the Southeast looked quite different than it looks now, and the flora and fauna that we have in this region reflects those past changes. It survived those changes. It was in part created by those changes. So rather than being homogeneous oak hickory forest, the Southeast has a wide range of habitat types that one might term extreme, a diversity of these extreme habitat types. And I'm going to talk about a few of these as sort of tell stories, tell evolutionary stories about a few of these habitats just as examples to sort of develop this idea that has basically brought about the crazy quilt of diversity that we have here in the South. So everyone who's ever worked for a heritage program, and a lot of you all in the federal agencies and other partners who are here, know that biodiversity is not distributed randomly and evenly across the landscape. The biodiversity is often, the analogy I have pretty frequently heard is the chocolate chip cookie. The chocolate chips embedded in the cookie, or maybe there are nuts in there too. We have this non-random distribution, and a lot of the biodiversity is in specialized, unique habitats as we go around. And it's also important for us to remember that extremity and diversity are local in time. What we see here today is not what was here 10,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. So a sort of paradigm that I use to think about the unglaciated southeastern United States, and yes, Cincinnati does fall in that biogeographic area, is this, that the South is largely warm and relatively moist. Some dry areas, some drier areas, and unsurprisingly, to the north, it's colder and moister. To the west, I think we all know, it's warmer and drier. And to the south, particularly as we go down into the Tamaulipan Plain in Texas and down into the Florida Peninsula, it's hotter and either wet or seasonally dry, particularly as we get down into the Florida Keys and the deep, deep south, as Leo mentioned. What we have seen is as past climates have changed, we see cold and moister conditions pushing southwards and then pushing back up. We see warm and dry conditions coming in from the west and then getting pushed back to the west. We see more tropical conditions moving north and then getting pushed down to more refugial areas. And so this has created evolutionary forces that have created and maintained the flora that we see today. So the first of my 4 habitat stories, high elevation rocky summits. This is Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina, one of the highest and rockiest and coldest places in the South. And it has a lot of special plants and animals, and among those is Geum radiatum, here shown. Its distribution occurring on about 15 mountaintops in North Carolina and Tennessee, and fun surveying opportunities for biologists there. And its closest relatives we now know from molecular and other studies are Geum calthifolium and Geum peckii. And Geum peckii is shown on the right here, its distribution being in Nova Scotia and the White Mountains of New Hampshire. This is what the plant looks like. Geum calthifolium, British Columbia, Alaska, across the Aleutians into East Asia, Siberia, Sakhalin, Japan, and so forth. This is a picture of it flowering on mountains in northern Japan. And so Geum radiatum, a sibling of these. Trichophorum cespitosum, deer hair bulrush, a circumboreal species, widespread across Scandinavia, Siberia, Alaska, Canada, but disjunct to basically those same set of mountain peaks in the southern Appalachians, a few additional ones. As far as we know, not speciated, maybe not even genetically altered from its northern relatives, but a disjunct population. We have federally listed species like Houstonia montana, sibling to Houstonia purpurea, shown here on the left, with a widespread southeastern, south of the glacial boundary distribution. And then Houstonia montana limited to a few mountaintops north of Asheville in the southern Blue Ridge. So I'm here partly to help cure animal blindness. Animals are another important part of biodiversity that should not be ignored. So I have put a few animals into this slideshow. So on these high elevation rocky summit cliffs, we also have nesting ravens, another circumboreal species. So if we look overall at the biogeography and history, the sort of deep time history of these habitats, we see a strong signal of both neo-endemics and paleo-endemics and unspeciated disjuncts that have been recruited from primarily old circumboreal lineages, most of which have a long history in cool temperate boreal and Arctic North America. So rhododendron, geum, Sebaldia, carex, et cetera. And a lot of strong Asian affinities, the relictual relationship of Eastern North America and Asia and the Bering land bridge plays into the flora that we see on these southern Appalachian mountains here in Dixie. But we also see some young species of warm temperate or even tropical lineages that have been long separated from Eurasia. Kalmia and Houstonia would be examples of those. So we have endemic and rare species that have been recruited from the south as well as from the north, even in these coldest habitats. So the northern elements are not surprising when you consider the tundra that occupied the southern mountains only 20,000 years ago. My second story is about serpentine barrens. And these are very interesting habitats in the southern Blue Ridge, very isolated and limited habitats. And they have a lot of disjunct species, many disjunct grasses from the north and the west, things like Deschampsia cespitosa, Elamus trachycaulus. You can see these distribution maps showing the sort of western and northern distribution. Muhlenbergia agglomerata, more northern in its primary distribution. Poa salchuensis, likewise. And Gentianopsis crinita, a northern disjunct to these serpentine barrens. Sporobolus heterolepis has a more midwestern distribution, disjunct to serpentine barrens here in southwestern North Carolina. Parnassia grandifolia occurs on these sites. This is a hardcore southeastern plants, but of a northern lineage. And we have increasingly been discovering endemic species here on these serpentine barrens. Symphyiotrichum rhiannon that I and colleagues named a few years ago. Well, I guess time flies, over a decade ago. The recently named Pacara serpenticola, named also from these sites. And we're working on what appears to be a new hexastylus species that seems to be endemic to the Buck Creek serpentine barren, with even shorter little snouts on the piggies than its relatives, and growing in large clonal patches with distinctive features in the flower as well. And now we also have genetic evidence of its differentiation from its closest relatives. So these serpentine barrens are sort of famous for their diversity of snakes, and particularly this guy, whose closest relatives are Mexican and southwestern, the timber rattlesnake. So the serpentine barrens, non-speciated disjuncts, and neo-endemics derive from mainly western North American lineages, but also northern and circumboreal lineages, and resident North American, eastern North American lineages, and some tropical components as well. Okay, so let's move to that flat, boring, vermin-infested coastal plain. So fire as a major factor maintaining these habitats. Bruce Soria and I did a paper a number of years ago about some of the disjunction and distribution patterns of endemism in the southeastern coastal plain. And Reed Noss and colleagues followed up recently with a paper emphasizing how the southeastern coastal plain is a worldwide, a global level biodiversity hotspot with 1,816 endemic plant species. And we'll ignore the animals for now, this time around. So in the coastal plain, Florida scrub, a really unique habitat with many endangered species. Ceratiola ericoides, crazy biogeography on this thing. Seems to have relatives in Spain and the Azores and southern South America. Who knows what's going on there? Pinus clausa, sand pine. It is in a group of pines that are more northern, Virginia pine, jack pine, Pinus banksiana, and the lodgepole pine complex out in the west. So Quercus inopina, the sandhill oak, a north temperate lineage, and indeed a recent phylogram developed by Paul Manos at Duke University shows inopina here in basically a gigantic clade of southern red oaks, Quercus falcata, Levis marylandica, Eliadii, arkansana, et cetera, et cetera. Ximenia americana of a tropical family, the Olicaceae, widespread in the Florida peninsula. And we let another animal in, sorry about that. Scrub jay, so a Mexican southwestern connection. The Florida scrub jay most closely related here to Mexican and southwestern species. How about this bad boy? So this is the Florida worm lizard, Rhinura, an ancient relict. The Rhinura is the basalmost branch evolutionarily within the amphisbaenians. The amphisbaenians themselves have this highly relictual distribution, mainly South America and Africa, and then one amphisbaenian in North America, so an ancient relictual thing. Another reptile, Anolis carolinensis. Very clearly now we can understand through molecular techniques that it has recently arrived in the southeastern United States, probably by rafting from Cuba. So interesting biogeography there. So Florida scrub, sort of the biogeographic summary here is a lot of West Indian connections, unsurprisingly, but also Mexican and southwestern US connections. Yet it's fundamentally Eastern North American. The dominant species, things like sand pine and the oaks and so forth, are north temperate species. So we have, once again, a sort of interesting mix of things. All right. Wet pine savannas, I'm going to go through this kind of quick so that I actually finish my talk on time. I have a bad habit of putting in too many slides and trying to do too much in talks. So the famous Venus flytrap, Dionea muscipula, recently petitioned for federal listing, showing significant declines. We can look at a whole suite of different species that have a very interesting distribution pattern, some of which have one or two or three of these four areas: Nova Scotia, southern New Jersey, southeastern North Carolina and adjacent South Carolina, and the Gulf Coast, particularly the Florida Panhandle. This is the distribution map of Lopheola americana, which has all four of those areas. And I'm going to show you a number of other things that have portions of those areas. When we look at the Tophieldiaceae and the distribution of the plants in it, it's largely north temperate, but with some interesting oddities, including South America and down into the southeastern coastal plain. Harperocalis, the celebrated endemic in the Florida Panhandle, now turns out to be part of a genus which is largely distributed in South America. So our Florida component is an isolated relict related to Guiana shield plants. Plea tenuifolia with the distribution of the North Carolina and the Florida Panhandle distribution, missing from Georgia. Gentiana autumnalis and Pinelliana, sister species. Gentiana autumnalis in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, Virginia to South Carolina, Gentiana pinelliana in the Florida Panhandle, separated at birth. Parnassia caroliniana here, southeastern North Carolina, disjunct to the Florida Panhandle. So we see this pattern over and over again. And even animals do it. The Pine Barrens tree frog, look at this distribution map. Southern New Jersey, coastal North and South Carolina, Florida Panhandle. When we see completely unrelated organism groups showing the same pattern, they're trying to tell us something, okay? There is a signal there. There is information that suggests that these are ancient relictual areas that have been able to hold on to biodiversity while areas in between have lost that biodiversity. The Sarraceniaceae, odd distribution, on the left Helianthera of the Guiana Shield, and on the right Darlingtonia of Oregon and Northern California. This is where Helianthera grows. How many of you all have seen this landscape? Thanks to, so this is what it really looks like, not actually very different. This is Roraima tepui on the Venezuela-Brazil border. So when we look at the phylogeny of the pitcher plants, I'm going to just focus in on the southeastern pitcher plants. We see 3 major clades. This is work that Jenny was involved with. We see 3 major clades, and once again, a sort of repeat of some of this pattern that I've shown you: southeastern, North Carolina and South Carolina, Florida Panhandle, major concentration areas, et cetera. So this kind of genetic work gives us important information that relates to conservation. So Sarracenia purpurea variety Montana was only relatively recently named, about 15 years ago. People have been skeptical as to whether it's really anything taxonomically, just a disjunct population of purple pitcher plants. And yet in the cladistic analysis, it comes out first in the branching pattern within the purpurea clade. Rosea comes out second, and then purpurea venosa and purpurea purpurea. So it looks like this is a distinctive taxon, a distinctive unit that is highly deserving of conservation and highly imperiled. It only occurs in a handful of mountain wetlands in the Asheville area, broader Asheville area. So we can see these coastal plain patterns. We see these major refugial areas in New Jersey, in coastal Carolinas, in the Florida Peninsula and South Florida, in the Gulf Coast, and also on the West Gulf Coast, so these refugial areas. So the wet pine savannas, we see a major involvement of tropical and subtropical lineages, but also cool temperate plants. Things like Parnassia, Tophieldia, and Triantha really belong to a northern flora. The southern edge of North America has provided access to suites of lineages that are tropical, that are southwestern, a wide range of things. And so we have this major area of endemism and relictual biodiversity. I think I'm going to go quickly through the rock houses. Endemics, once again, jumping back into the inland, southeast, the Cumberland sandwort, Stenonthium diffusum, rockhouse featherbells with its relationships to widespread, both of those have relationships, sister relationships to widespread southeastern plants. Silene rotundifolia, likewise a Cumberlandian plant related to more widespread relatives. Heuchera parviflora recently, using both molecular and morphological information, has been split up into 4 taxa. So we multiply our blessings. We multiply our blessings. So now, sorry about that. Now, well, get the right button here. Multiple species across the interior southeast in this complex. The green salamander, it now looks like the Blue Ridge population is a separate species than the Cumberlandian population. So we'll have to take things like that into consideration when we work on conservation of these groups. The filmy ferns, 4 different genera of filmy ferns in these rockhouse kind of habitats: Vandenboschia, Didymoglossum, Hymenophyllum, and Crepidomenes. And tropical ferns in Kentucky. What's with that? So these lineages are not closely related to one another. These different genera that I just showed you actually date back to the early Cretaceous in terms of their divergence from one another. We don't entirely know how long these filmy ferns have been there in these habitats, but very interesting. And we're even going to let an invert in here. Hypochilus. So this is a ancient relictual spider genus distributed in eastern North America, East Asia, and western North America. Does that sound familiar to any plant distributions that you all know? So, so a study of its taxonomy has shown what the authors called fractal genetic structuring, basically that it's sort of the more you look, the more diversity you see, and I won't be surprised to see this come out repeatedly. So Hypochilus pococki had this distribution, and now the authors are suggesting that there are these major different clades within it that are isolated from one another and show genetic divergence. So these rock houses, we see ancient tropical lineages of ferns. We see northern cryophylls, ancient relict lineages undergoing active radiation, spiders, club mosses. We see warm temperate recent derivatives. And what seems to be the key here is buffering of extremes, both hot and cold and dry. So we end up with cryophyll species that like coldness because it never gets very hot in these sites. And we have species that are tropical because it never gets very cold or never very dry in these sites. So I want to diverge to a couple other topics quickly before I close, and that is a little quick analysis of vascular plant species being named in the southeastern US. So 500 species have been named since 1960 or are in the process of being named. That's about 10% of the whole native flora. Most are narrow endemics. They're G1s and G2s or G3s. They therefore have a large influence on conservation priorities. And perhaps as much as 50% of these G1, G3 taxa in our region have been named in the last 50 years. So our increasing knowledge is leading us to have a much deeper understanding of the conservation targets and needs in our region. And no, it's not slowing down. If anything, the speed of naming new species is increasing. We are not sort of asymptoting to zero. We are actively adding new species as we research the southeastern flora. And just a few here, and I just wanted to also mention that we're also bringing previously named species that had been sort of casually lumped. After further study, we're recognizing that many of these are actually good species, and they're G1 or sadly GX. Everyone knows their G ranks here, right? GX, one of the saddest G ranks in the world. So naming new species, we need to get on it. We need to move forward with this. It has a lot of implications for the work that we do as conservationists. So here's sort of a list in chronological order from 2011 into the 2013 or 14 of newly named species and all. So what is the pattern of this geographically? Well, there's a tendency for the rich to get richer. Dwayne is sitting over there and he's saying, I'm going to break that rule. He's nodding. Okay, so the states that tend to have the greatest biodiversity already, the places that have that greatest biodiversity, it's just increasing. Trillium pusillum complex likely to be split up into multiple species. Liriodendron, there's surely only one species of Liriodendron in the southeastern US, right? Recent work by my grad student Carl Fetters shows that the Florida peninsular populations of Liriodendron are very strongly differentiated from the rest of the species. And this is just a partial list of the G1 species in the southeast. The list goes on. Okay, so Vivian is here and did some of this work with looking at recovery spending. I think we all know that plants don't get their fair share. I'm not going to belabor the point, in sort of heading towards closing, I wanted to show you all this quote from Alan Graham on past ecosystem dynamics and fashioning views on conserving extant New World vegetation. He comments that, that what we are actually or additionally doing is setting aside way stations The biotas within these sites will be temporary because of both anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic causes. From a geologic perspective, ecosystems of varying composition will be passing through them and at an ever-quickening pace. The essential point is that these way stations be available in the future to accommodate the new arrivals. So our network of conservation areas that we are being led to by a particular rare species is telling us areas that have resilience in the landscape, that have the potential to maintain conservation. So these super rare, highly imperiled species are not just weird, they're telling us where there are real fundamental cores of biodiversity that we need to conserve. So any of you all who have mutual funds or have invested in stocks probably know this phrase: past performance is not an indicator of future results. Except in conservation, perhaps it is. These areas that have been able to retain biodiversity through past climate changes, through past alterations and so forth, are more likely to be able to do so in the future. And a paper by Clinton Jenkins out of the Stuart Pimm's lab at Duke looked at mismatch between US protected lands and biodiversity priorities and created this map where the red and orange colors are the hot areas, the greatest need, the greatest mismatch, the greatest sites where there is very significant biodiversity. They didn't even look at plants other than trees. So this is based on a kind of subset of organism groups, animal biased, I might add. But where they found the greatest areas, you can see, are primarily in California, and then in various areas in the Southeast: Edwards Plateau, Florida Panhandle, Florida Keys, the Cumberlands, the Southern Blue Ridge, et cetera. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a couple other quick hits. One is about tools. So as botanists, let's call everyone in this crowd a botanist. We need tools to help us. And so one of those tools is our floras. And this shows Tom Smith of the Virginia Heritage Program with the new Flora of Virginia a few years ago. And that's John Clayton, the author of the first and only previous Flora of Virginia, who came back from the grave to attend, and he's holding his Flora from 1763. But you know, what we all really want is Spock's tricorder, right? We want to be able to sort of point it and say, oh, there are 103 plant species in that plot, and here's the list of them, or et cetera. So we're not quite there yet, but I think we're making tremendous advancement in providing useful tools to the botanical community. Not just technical manuals, floras, but online resources like the Flora of North America, a great generation of new sophisticated wildflower guides like this one by Linda Chafin for Georgia. You know, it's not your father's Peterson wildflower guide, right? And they're oriented towards portions of the South. We're working on one currently at the North Carolina Botanical Garden as well. And we're also developing things like Flora apps. And I know a few of you in this audience have used the Flora Quest app that we released that covers most of the southeastern flora. So I wanted to give you a quick update on that. So it allows filtering of keys by your GPS location. It simplifies the key based on where you are. And you can also filter out unlikely species that are rare waifs and things that you're not likely to find in a natural area. We'll be doing a new release here in the winter. It'll have a new scrape of the flora with new taxonomy and new keys. It'll include all of Florida. And we'll have a newly designed observations mode that basically will enable you to make iNaturalist observations directly out of the app. And it's still only going to be iOS, Apple only. Michael Lee, who works with me, is considering Androidizing it, but hasn't quite gotten up the courage yet. So I wanted to close with a sort of personal reflection. This is a picture of me, Hervey McEver, and Rob Sutter. Some of you know some of those characters from back long ago. So in thinking about this talk, I came to realize that I got in this business 40 years ago. 1976, I've been doing this professionally, rare plant conservation. And I did start when I was 5. So I'm not as old as you think, all right? So, but some of my, my sort of reflections on it is how much has changed and how good we have it now. So this isn't one of those, you know, oh, wasn't it great back in the good old days. This is actually the reverse, and I think we need to take that to heart and recognize it as an opportunity and a challenge. So back in 1976, the Endangered Species Act had just been passed. NEPA had just been passed. The Heritage Network had just been created by the Nature Conservancy, and only a few heritage programs were up and operating. All of them, by the way, in the South. Tennessee, TVA, North Carolina, and South Carolina were the first 4 heritage programs in existence. Let's see, what else? Finding biodiversity. To find biodiversity, we rarely had aerial photographs. We did not have GIS or GPS. We couldn't overlay layers of soils and geology and hydrology and so forth. Conserving biodiversity. The Nature Conservancy had about 100 employees in the world at that time. They now have 3,200. Local land trusts pretty much had not come into existence. There were a few scattered around. There are now 25 in North Carolina alone, local land trusts. The Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, did they have botanists? Maybe a few, but certainly not like what we see in this room here today. Let's see, pretty much all foresters, botanists, land managers were white men. I see a lot of women in the crowd and at least a few, a little better ethnic diversity, though we still have a ways to go on that. So we have now, you know, amazing tools. We have a conservation community, which basically didn't exist 40 years ago. We have a set of conservation professionals to talk with, to share information with, and I didn't even say there was no email or internet, right? Floras were written basically by professors for professors. We didn't have the kind of tools that were trying to bring botany to the masses. Anyway, so you know, I guess I sort of approach this, this task of conservation as a hopeful cynic. I don't have a lot of faith that we're going in a good direction in the long run for biodiversity. But I think we have as a duty to pay it forward, to do what we can, to pass it on to the next generation and let them take on the challenges. But, you know, if not us, who? If not now, when? Now is the critical time to do what we can to conserve biodiversity across the region and pass it forward into the future. So I hope this meeting will be a great opportunity for all of us to share information, ideas, and hopefully inspiration. Thanks. I don't know how that happened. I had way too many slides.
Please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll bring you the microphone.
I mean, this might be a naive question from someone who's from outside the area, but generally, you're finding more species, yes? You're showing biodiversity is going with more species. So the man in the street is being told that species are disappearing with global warming and everything. So how does the man in the street see one side of it, you're finding all these species, and then another side of it, they're telling you all the species are disappearing?
Yeah, so I guess I perceive that as something of a PR question, I guess, a sort of how is that portrayed. And in the southeastern United States for plants, have we seen widespread extinctions of plants in the southeast U.S.? There's really only a handful we can point to. Wes Knapp is here, who's been sort of researching this across North America. How many extinct species are there? So we do really have only a handful, and I think part of what that shows is that our flora is actually more resilient than maybe we give it credit for. Most of those extinctions are of species which have extremely specialized habitats, maybe single-site endemics where their entire habitat has been destroyed. But plants, we don't get into the sorts of issues with or not to the degree and in the same way of demography and so forth that we get into with animal species, where passenger pigeon, literally the most abundant bird species in the world, went from having a population of 5 billion on Earth to having a population of 0 on Earth. So that kind of collapse, we don't see that happening with plants. I don't know. I think it'll be an interesting thing for us to talk about over the next few days, how we do portray what's going on. We'd like to think of ourselves as, we're the experts and we know the flora. And I think one of the messages that has come through loud and clear for me over the last few decades is that, man, we don't know jack. And about most of those individual species, we don't know how to manage them. We don't know much about their species biology. We don't know what pollinates them. We don't know what soil conditions they really need. We've got some guesses. We have some ideas and all, but we don't know much about any of the wild species out there. Even species of economic significance, our knowledge is really pretty minimal. We're the thin green line studying a great world of diversity out there, 6,000 native species in the southeast. So I guess I think we do need to abandon some of the aura of we know it all and admit that there's a whole lot that we don't know. And we're in a world where citizen science, we can engage things like citizen science. We can get help finding out some of these things. But we do face some challenges sort of professionally, just with how are we going to increase the ranks of people who are interested in this? How are we going to get the funding to do that? It's not an easy problem. So I guess once again, hopeful cynicism.
Alan, you paid a lot of attention to ranges and biogeography. Can you talk about how that perspective is an argument for taking a regional approach to conservation in the Southeast?
Yeah, so I used it, I think, in this talk a lot to kind of talk about deep time and the kind of perspectives that it gives us on how the flora has assembled, through millions of years. And I think there's sort of, I guess I don't like to oversimplify because I'm going to give a somewhat complicated answer again on this. But I think, yes, we do need to work as much as we can and look at things as much as we can regionally. Part of that has to do with setting priorities on a more regional basis rather than on a sort of siloed basis on this state versus that state. Things like the G ranks that NatureServe and the Heritage Network develop helps us do that. We're not just focused on this species, which is super rare in North Carolina, but is dirt common across the line in Tennessee. I think the message of sort of the resilience of the flora is an important one, but we don't want to take from that, well, we don't need to worry about it, and it can take a licking and keep on ticking. There's some sort of complexity, I think, in the message that we learn about the flora, its origins, and its history.
That was terrific. Jennifer Seska has helped me to understand that I'm an optimistic, mission-driven introvert. But I feel strongly that that will help us to get to where we need to be at the end of 3 days here. So we are going to take a 15-minute break. That puts us at starting.